I did not say that. I filed it instead the way I filed every sacrifice my ethics tribunal had ever weighed, because on Halcyon Reach, a life's worth was measured by exactly one metric: what you were willing to give up and for whom, and what you were owed in return for giving it. I was presiding over a worth assessment for a retiring war elder in the 9th Hall of Accounts, calculating, per Dorun formal doctrine, the precise value of a life by tallying every sacrifice made across its span, each one weighed against the debt owed to those who received it, each debt formally recorded, formally acknowledged, formally discharged before a life could be considered complete. When the survey reassignment reached me, I was Dorun of the Halcyon Reach, Ethics Tribunal Observer, and in 197 cycles of service, I had assessed the worth of over 11,000 lives using the same unbroken doctrine. Sacrifice made for kin outweighed, sacrifice made for strangers. Sacrifice made under compulsion outweighed. Sacrifice made freely because compulsion at least implied a cost extracted by force rather than squandered by choice. And sacrifice made for someone who could never repay the resulting debt was, by definition, irrational, an asset given away with no mechanism to recover it, and therefore excluded from worth assessment entirely as a data error rather than weighed as a genuine act. I did not carry a visible wound the way Deathworlder cultures counted cost in scar tissue. I carried mine in the sacrifice ledger etched across my sternum in raised scar text, a permanent, growing record of every formal sacrifice I had personally made across my career, each one debited against a specific named beneficiary who owed the resulting debt, whether they had yet discharged it or not. The ledger was not private. Every Doran of standing wore theirs visibly, because a sacrifice no one could verify was on Halcyon indistinguishable from a sacrifice that had never happened at all. Tribunal Liaison Kess found me mid-assessment. New candidate world flagged. Designation: human. Survey drones logged a sacrifice pattern our worth assessment algorithm rejected as invalid input. Specify the rejection parameters. A human female donated a paired organ, survivable to donate, but carrying permanent medical risk to herself for the remainder of her life, to a recipient with no kinship relationship, no prior acquaintance of any kind, and no established possibility of repayment. The algorithm flagged the transaction as irrational sacrifice and excluded it automatically from calculation. Command requested manual review before the exclusion becomes permanent record. In 197 cycles, I had never encountered a sacrifice this deliberate, this materially costly to the giver, and this thoroughly, deliberately disconnected from any debt structure at all. I logged the anomaly and diverted a survey vessel toward the assignment, expecting a straightforward confirmation of an algorithmic parsing error, nothing more substantial than a correction to the exclusion criteria. I brought 2 observers. Vel, a debt calculation specialist who treated every unassigned sacrifice as evidence of a system fault rather than a genuine data point, and Sira, junior enough in her training that she still occasionally found the automatic exclusions troubling rather than simply obviously correct. The Human Worlds file described unremarkable social bonds by any Halcyon metric. Kinship structures, professional relationships, nothing our tribunal's models would flag as unusual on their own. The anomaly, per the drones, was isolated entirely to this single specific transaction. By every framework my tribunal used, this should have resolved within a cycle as a simple confirmation. I did not expect what the drones had actually surfaced. We settled our vessel in cloaked orbit, above a temperate metropolitan region, and I began the standard sacrifice audit sweep that should have concluded the matter immediately. It did not conclude. The first anomalous entry arrived on the second day, and like every entry that followed, it presented itself as something almost administratively mundane, which made it, in its own way, more unsettling than anything dramatic could have been. Local surveillance confirmed the flagged individual. Designation: Priya Sharma, 34 years of age, an accountant by profession. A detail our matrix flagged with something almost approaching irony, given her own species' apparent indifference to formal ledgers where it mattered most, who had, 8 months prior to our observation, undergone surgical donation of a kidney to a recipient identified entirely through a public donor registry. Records confirmed the two had exchanged no communication of any kind prior to the procedure beyond strictly necessary medical coordination. shared no kinship structure our genealogical scans could identify, and that Sharma had explicitly declined. Per registry documentation, any offer of financial compensation for the donation, which local regulation would have permitted within limited legal bounds. Vel ran the debt calculation twice, then adjusted the parameters and ran it a third time. As though a different configuration might surface a hidden repayment structure, the raw data had simply failed to capture. There is no repayment mechanism established anywhere in this record. The recipient owes a debt of extraordinary magnitude. His continued survival, functionally, depends on it. And there is no formal structure requiring him to discharge that debt in any measurable way. This sacrifice cannot be weighed by any method I know. It has no counterpart entry. She is not required one. Then the sacrifice is uncollectable by design, not by accident. On Halcyon, we would call this a wasted asset. Value given away with no mechanism to recover it, ever, for anyone, including her own descendants who might otherwise have inherited a claim against the debt. I filed the entry as sacrifice collectible and continued the sweep, though something behind my sacrifice ledger scar had already begun logging a question no worth assessment doctrine I had ever studied could answer. The catalog grew across the following days, and it grew in a direction that troubled Vel with an intensity I had not previously seen him direct at any prior survey subject in our years working together. I observed Sharma continue her ordinary professional routine, reviewing, per employment records cross-referenced with her firm's internal logs, other people's financial documents with a thoroughness that regularly exceeded her compensated hours, catching and correcting errors that were, by the explicit terms of her employment contract, not her responsibility to catch at all, for clients who would, per her own recorded comments to a colleague, never even know there was a mistake, let alone that I fixed it before it became their problem. Her employer's records suggested this was simply known and unremarked upon among her colleagues, not celebrated, not formally acknowledged, simply understood as how Priya Sharma worked. She corrects errors that carry no consequence for her if she leaves them uncorrected, Sira observed, reviewing the fourth day's professional surveillance. For clients who will never know the error existed, let alone that she personally absorbed the additional uncompensated time required to fix it before submission, I did not have an answer. I filed the question, the way I had begun filing everything that resisted resolution under any doctrine I actually trusted. The pattern sharpened considerably on the seventh day, when I observed the kidney recipient, designation confirmed as a man in his 50s. No connection to Sharma beyond the transplant itself. Attempt, through the donor registry's optional contact release mechanism, to locate her directly, stating in his own recorded application, translated, "I want to find some way to pay this back. I don't even know what that looks like yet, but I have to try." Sharma declined the contact request. Her stated reason, recovered from a brief exchange with the registry's coordinator, translated, "I didn't do it, so he'd owe me something. If he wants to thank me, he can go be alive. That's the payment. That's the whole payment." She has explicitly rejected the formation of the debt itself, Vel said, and for the first time in 7 days of observation, I heard in his voice something that was not merely analytical resistance to an unresolved data point. It was closer to something approaching alarm. Not merely declined to collect on an existing debt, rejected the premise that a debt exists at all, on principle, as a condition of the sacrifice's own meaning. On Halcyon, a sacrifice without an acknowledged debt is not a sacrifice at all, I said. It is simply loss. Then what is it here? I did not have an answer for him. I filed the question instead, alongside all the others. I observed in the days that followed further evidence of the same pattern operating quietly beneath the surface of Sharma's ordinary life. A colleague's tuition shortfall covered without acknowledgement through an anonymous internal fund Sharma had. Per financial records our forensic analysts eventually traced, established and personally sustained for 3 years, a neighbor's unpaid utility bill, settled without the neighbor's knowledge. Discovered only when our own retrospective audit cross-referenced payment records neither party had any reason to connect. None of it generated a debt Sharma seemed to want acknowledged. All of it, our matrix confirmed, she had structured specifically to prevent the recipient from ever learning who to thank. She is not merely declining repayment when it is offered, Sira said. On the 9th day, her voice carrying a note I recognized now as the same disquiet I had begun to feel myself. She is actively engineering her own sacrifices so that repayment becomes structurally impossible from the outset. She does not want the debt to exist even as a theoretical possibility. The crisis arrived through our own failure, the way it always does. Our vessel's containment field, strained by the extended observation cycle, our increasingly complex investigation, had required well past its original window, fractured during a routine repositioning maneuver above the metropolitan region on the 9th day. Vel caught the fault 5 seconds before critical failure. Insufficient time for controlled displacement to unpopulated terrain, the only outcome our doctrine considered acceptable under the circumstances. We came down hard in a public park within walking distance of Sharma's residence, cloak failing entirely on impact, my own carapace pinned beneath collapsed structural plating that had buckled inward across my lower thorax, Syrah's mobility compromised by a fractured limb, and our extraction beacon corrupted beyond any field repair our combined efforts could manage. My own diagnostic readout gave me, at current internal bleeding rate, perhaps 7 minutes before my condition became unrecoverable, regardless of what happened afterward. Reach protocol was absolute and unambiguous. A vessel suffering catastrophic failure over an uncontacted world executes silent emergency extraction regardless of crew injury, or accepts total loss rather than risk direct contact that could compromise formal first contact doctrine. I gave the order for silent extraction. It failed immediately. The same fracture that had grounded us had corrupted the beacon beyond repair, and there was, by every calculation available to me, no path to survival that did not involve a violation of doctrine I had personally enforced for a century and a half. I do not fully understand, even now, what made me transmit an open distress signal in direct violation of everything I had built my career defending, rather than accept silent loss as protocol demanded. I told the review tribunal afterward that Syrah's fractured limb and my own deteriorating condition made silent loss for both of us a near certainty, and that this justified the breach on medical grounds alone. That was true. It was not the whole truth. The whole truth was that I had spent 9 days watching a woman give away something irreplaceable to a stranger and refuse even his gratitude in return. Watched her structure her own generosity specifically so that no debt could ever attach to it, and some part of my sacrifice ledger scared, century-and-a-half trained framework had concluded, without my formal authorization, that if my crew was going to be found broken and unrecoverable in an unfamiliar park, it should happen as close as possible to the one human on this entire world who had already proven, repeatedly, that she gave without ever requiring the debt to exist in the first place. Priya Sharma was walking home from her office when our wreckage came down less than 200 meters from her usual path. She did not run a cost-benefit calculation on an unidentified alien crash in a public park at dusk. She simply moved toward it the same way. I understood watching her cross the grass without hesitation. She appeared to move toward every cost she had never once been formally asked to pay. She found me pinned beneath the buckled plating first, and did not hesitate at my physiology, the raised scar text ledger visible where my thorax plating had cracked away, nothing in my architecture resembling anything her species' evolutionary history could have prepared her for. "Okay," she said, translated, already working at the debris with her bare hands, voice steady in a register I had begun, across 9 days of observation, to recognize as fear given somewhere useful to go rather than allowed to paralyze her. "Okay. I don't know what's happening right now, but you're stuck, and I've got 2 working hands, so let's use them before we figure out the rest of it." She freed me first, then turned immediately to Syrah's fractured limb, working with the same unhurried, unasked-for competence, calling emergency services on a device our translation matrix struggled to keep pace with, as she gave our location, our apparent injuries, and, when the dispatcher's translated questions clearly asked what, precisely, she was describing, a simple, honest, "I don't know what they are. Doesn't matter. Just send someone." As she pulled me clear of the wreckage, my sacrifice ledger scar exposed where the plating had cracked away, I understood it had never meant what 197 cycles of halcyon doctrine had told me it meant. I had believed it meant I have given precisely what was owed to those who owe me in return, and the ledger stands as permanent proof that nothing I have given has ever been lost or forgotten. Held against Priya Sharma's hands, giving effort and care to a stranger with no possible repayment structure at all, structured deliberately so that no debt could ever attach to what she was doing for me. In that moment either, I understood the scar meant something far smaller than I had spent a career believing. I had learned to give only what I could later collect, formally, permanently, visibly, so that the giving itself would never be mistaken for loss. She had given away something irreplaceable and called the debt paid the moment the stranger simply kept living, and she was in this park at this moment, doing precisely the same thing for me, expecting nothing recorded, nothing owed, nothing carried forward at all. I did not say any of this to her. I filed it because filing was the only vocabulary 197 cycles had given me for something this large, and even as paramedics arrived and Sharma stepped back to let them work, still refusing, translated, to give her name to the small crowd that had gathered, I catalogued the sensation the only way I knew how. Structural realignment, category unresolved, severity, total. The review came 8 days later aboard the recovery vessel under a tribunal I had personally chaired for over a decade. Tribunal Elder Karsis presided, which told me the severity of the breach before she spoke a single formal word. You transmitted an open distress beacon in populated, uncontacted territory, she said. You permitted direct physical assistance and rescue from a local sentient. In violation of doctrine you have personally authored and enforced for 197 cycles. Do you dispute the record? I do not dispute the record. Then justify your continued position on this transcript alone. I did not read from prepared documentation. A century and a half of ledger vocabulary had given me precise language for debt magnitude and repayment structure, and none of it contained the argument I actually needed to make, so I built the case from the catalog instead, and let the evidence carry what the vocabulary could not. Elder Karsis, I have assessed the worth of over 11,000 lives using a doctrine built entirely on the premise that sacrifice without a collectible debt is not sacrifice at all. It is simply loss, and therefore excluded from meaningful calculation. I have 9 days of continuous observation of a human who gave a stranger a kidney and explicitly rejected every attempt at repayment on principle, who quietly discharges other people's debts, tuition, unpaid bills, uncompensated professional labor, specifically structured so the recipient never learns who to thank, and who, upon finding 3 unidentified, physiologically alien beings broken in a public park, gave the same uncollected, unrecorded assistance to us that she has apparently given to every stranger she has ever encountered in genuine need. I do not have a classification tier for a species capable of sacrifice this costly, this deliberate, and this thoroughly, intentionally stripped of any mechanism for collection. I am not asking this tribunal to feel anything about that. I am asking it to explain, on the evidence, how our entire worth assessment doctrine survives contact with a species that appears to consider the debt itself the flaw, rather than the sacrifice. You are describing one accountant, Karsis said, though I noted, filing it precisely, that her voice had lost the edge with which she had opened the proceeding. Not a species-wide capacity. I am describing a pattern this survey confirmed as unremarkable within her own community, Elder. Colleagues who knew and said nothing. An employer's records that noted the pattern without formally acknowledging it. A neighbor who never learned who paid an overdue bill. I have the footage. I do not have full certainty what it means for this world's classification. I am certain only that a doctrine built on the premise that every sacrifice requires a collectible debt does not survive contact with a species that appears to consider the collectible debt the part worth eliminating. The chamber held silent long enough that I believed, filing the silence, that I had achieved nothing at all. Your position is suspended pending formal review, Karsis said finally, not revoked. The classification is logged provisionally as sacrifice model reassessment. This tribunal has never applied that designation to any surveyed world. It will require extended study before any observer, present or future, closes this file. It was not vindication. It was a door left open rather than sealed, and I understood, filing the ruling away, that it was more than my breach of doctrine had any right to earn me. I wrote my formal assessment across the following days in the technical language the tribunal required, sacrifice magnitude data, debt rejection frequency, cross-referenced incident timestamps. Buried in the final appendix, where doctrine does not require sentiment and therefore will not scrutinize it, I wrote. Subject Priya Sharma demonstrates repeated, deliberate sacrifice of significant personal cost, structured specifically to prevent debt formation or acknowledgement by the recipient. At a frequency and consistency this tribunal's doctrine has no precedent to weigh. I cannot certify this species as irrational in its sacrifice patterns. I cannot certify the mechanism by which they derive meaning from sacrifice, absent a collectible debt, without our own doctrine's foundational premise to explain it. I can certify only that a species which gives away what can never be repaid, and considers that the entire point rather than the flaw, cannot remain filed as a data error under any framework this tribunal currently maintains. The report moved up the chain to elders who had never had unhurried hands clear wreckage from around their fractured plating, with absolutely nothing expected in return. I returned to limited duty once the inquiry closed without formal sanction, uncertain whether I had earned that mercy or simply been extended one I had not yet learned how to repay, a phrase I noted myself using afterward with a discomfort I had not anticipated. I keep an unofficial file now, one no tribunal has requested. Passive surveillance confirms Priya Sharma is unchanged. She has continued in the months since our contact, correcting errors no one asked her to fix, quietly discharging debts she structures, so the debtor never learns her name, still declining the gratitude of a man who owes her, by any measure my species has ever used, his entire continued existence. I do not look at my sacrifice ledger the way I once did. I understand now it meant I had learned to give only what I expected returned, formally, permanently, visibly recorded, so the giving would never be mistaken for loss. She gave away something she would never see repaid, structured the gift so repayment became impossible by design, and called that, not the ledger, not the debt, not the acknowledgement, the entire point of having something worth giving away at all. I do not know if I will encounter her again. My tribunal has not authorized further contact, and I have not requested it, though the request remains drafted, unsent, in the same file as everything else about this world I have not yet closed. If it comes to that, if some future crisis brings me into range of a species my own doctrine still cannot fully classify, I have already decided what I will do. I am simply waiting for the moment someone asks it of me.